Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for African News with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, enough's enough, says Chad as it pulls its peacekeeping forces out of Central African Republic. Chad says its troops are there to help, but instead are being blamed for the escalating crisis of Central African violence. Also, over 80 delegates were in Brussels for EU-African talks. Those are wrapped up today and on the final day focused on normalising official immigration from Africa to Europe whilst cracking down on human trafficking. And the US and Algeria pledge to work more closely together to battle terrorism in the Sahel. US Secretary of State John Kerry is in Algiers today on his first visit to the North African nation. First up, Chad said that it is pulling 800 of its troops out of Central African Republic after they have had enough of being the targets of what authorities are calling a gratuitous and malicious campaign. The Chadian Foreign Affairs ministers said that forces in CAR to help fight back against escalating violence have instead been blamed for the country's problems. Now, the decision comes just days after Chadian troops are accused of killing dozens of civilians by opening fire on a crowd in Bangui over the weekend. Well, for more on this, we're joined from the Central African Republic by our correspondent, James Andre. He's in Bangui. James, now, can Central African Republic do without Chad's peacekeeping troops?
It's going to be quite difficult. We're speaking to Union African officials earlier today, and they were telling us that indeed it's 850 men out of a contingent of 6,000. So, of course, it's a big chunk of those soldiers who would indeed leave. And also that the fact that they control the northern part of the country along the border with Chad, if they were to indeed leave the MISCA, well, that would be the end of the international forces' control over that area. So we have had a few statements that have come out both from the CAR government, who basically said that they regret the decision by Chad and that they hope that the cooperation with their neighboring and brother country, as they put it, that shares a long border with CAR will continue unharmed. And also there was a statement really a few minutes ago by the head of the African Union, and she was basically saying that she understood the decision of Chad, but we're still hoping that Chad will continue its actions to try and pacify and stabilize the CAR. And she reminded as well in that statement how important this crisis is on a regional level and the dangers of destabilizing the whole area here in Central Africa.
Now, in the country itself, there will be some civilians who no doubt feel fair that the Chadian troops are pulling out, but a lot of Central African civilians will actually be quite pleased to see the back of them.
Yeah, that's true. For a very long time now, indeed, the Chadians have been accused in the Christian communities mainly of supporting the Seleka or being allied with the Muslims. And that is why they've been quite squarely targeted by the anti-Balaka Christian militias. I actually witnessed this a month and a half ago when I was in Sierra for my first trip. And it was very clear that there was a lot of resentment towards the Chadian contingent in the Christian camp. On the other hand, of course, this is very bad news for the Muslims. And it's a real question mark. Are all the Muslims here in Bangui going to leave the city after this announcement? Because indeed, they saw the Chadian contingent as one of the more motivated parts of the MISCA for protecting Muslims. But it's important to note that indeed, there have been many problems in the past few months with the Chadian contingent. And there's been quite a lot of violence. And the people on the Christian side, indeed, you can be sure that a lot of people are quite happy to see the back of them indeed.
Thanks very much. James Andre there for us in Bangui, the Central African capital. Central African Republic was on the agenda yesterday, but today EU and African heads of state in Brussels for a two-day joint summit were focusing on normalising official immigration from Africa to Europe. They also were pushing on cracking down on human trafficking. Up to 20,000 illegal migrants are estimated to have died at sea trying to reach Europe over the last 2 decades. Africa's economic ambitions also took centre stage at the summit on Thursday. Leaders from both blocs are keen to take African development up a gear, and for that, it needs cash.
We have to put the emphasis on investment. That's what Africa needs. Africa is the continent with the highest growth, more than 5% in the last decade. That means that Africa is the continent of the future. We need more capital, we need investors, we need trade, much more than we need development aid.
Well, Maeve McMahon is in Brussels for us. She joins us now. Maeve, so the plan is clearly more trade, less aid. But isn't that already the case to some extent?
Absolutely. And I mean, well, development aid will continue, but the basis today was on more trade. I mean, the main message really of this fourth EU-Africa summit was that the EU-Africa partnership is no longer about them being a donor recipient, that more it's about an equal partnership. The thing is, back in 2007 in Lisbon, when both European Union leaders and African Union leaders agreed on their partnership, times were different. But since then, Africa has grown at a rapid pace and Europe was faced with an extremely spiralling debt crisis. So one message today was, of course, that there's huge opportunities offered by Africa. And another point was the need for Africa to keep its youth in Africa, especially its most educated ones, and stop them from travelling over to Europe and United States. But in order to do that, Africa has to do more to ensure rule of law so that young people can gain access to mortgages or incentives to create businesses and become entrepreneurs. Now, the head of the African Union Commission today, she said, if we concentrate on improving the skills of our people and investing in them, they will not end up in Lampedusa. And that tragic note was also discussed today here, and both EU and African leaders agreed on a joint statement, a joint plan, a 3-year plan, where they will they will facilitate legal migration in the next few years in return for Africa doing more to police its borders and fighting human trafficking. But the EU member states need to do more as well on migration. According to one senior source in the Commission that I spoke to recently, she said that that dossier is a time bomb sitting on the desks of the new Commission that will start after the European elections.
Thanks very much, Maeve McMahon there for us in Brussels. In other news, Lagos's High Court ordered the government to stop harassing its suspended central bank chief and awarded him over €215,000 in damages. Lamida Sanusi was ousted in February after he'd revealed that billions in state oil revenue had gone missing. The court ordered that Sanusi's passport be returned and restrained President Goodluck Jonathan's government from arresting him without due process. Sanusi is also separately suing the state over his suspension. Now, the US and Algeria have pledged to work more closely together to battle terrorism in the Sahel. US Secretary of State John Kerry was in Algiers today on his first visit to the North African nation. He says that Washington wants to help strengthen borders in the region. Algeria says it's pushing for more intelligence sharing.
For his first official visit to Algeria, the US Secretary of State John Kerry came with a strong message. Washington will continue to help the northern African country to fight terrorism in the vast Sahel region, home to one of the world's most active branches of al-Qaeda.
There is only one way to respond between states who are joined together in the principle of fighting against terrorism, and that one way is cooperation. We have to cooperate. I think Algeria completely understands that and is dedicated and committed to it.
Algeria is already a key partner in Washington's campaign against Islamist fighters who have tried to spread across the Maghreb after the French military drove them out of Mali last year. Since American surveillance drones have been placed in neighboring Mali, Niger, and along Algeria's southern border. The information is then shared with the Algerian army on the ground to enable them to engage in operations. Last month, the Algerian army killed 8 suspected militants near its border with Tunisia. The Algerian army has also recently deployed more troops on its eastern border with Libya and has taken measures to crack down on suspected weapons smugglers.
Julia Seeger there. That wraps up Africa News for now. Join us again, though. A short break and more news and headlines coming up. Take care.